This was said in a tone which quenched Mitchell Arden's last hope. The portion of the moon which the projectile was nearing was the northern hemisphere, that which the selenographic maps place below, for these maps are generally drawn after the outline given by the glasses, and we know that they reverse the objects. Such was the Mappa Selenographica of Boer and Moedler, which Barbicane consulted. This northern hemisphere presented vast plains dotted with isolated mountains. At midnight the moon was full. At that precise moment, the travelers should have alighted upon it if the mischievous meteor had not diverted their course. The orb was exactly in the condition determined by the Cambridge Observatory. It was mathematically at its perigee, and at the zenith of the 28th parallel. An observer placed at the bottom of the enormous Columbiad, pointed perpendicularly to the horizon, would have framed the moon in the mouth of the gun. A straight line drawn through the axis of the piece would have passed through the center of the orb of night. It is needless to say that during the night of the 5th-6th of December, the travelers took not an instant's rest. Could they close their eyes when so near this new world? No, all their feelings were concentrated in one single thought. See, representatives of the earth, of humanity, past and present, all centered in them. It is through their eyes that the human race look at these lunar regions and penetrate the secrets of their satellite. A strange emotion filled their hearts as they went from one window to the other. Their observations, reproduced by Barbicane, were rigidly determined. To take them, they had glasses; to correct them, maps. As regards the optical instruments at their disposal, they had excellent marine glasses specially constructed for this journey. They possessed magnifying powers of 100. They would thus have brought the moon to within a distance, apparent, of less than 2,000 leagues from the earth. But then, at a distance which for 3 hours in the morning did not exceed 65 miles, and in a medium free from all atmospheric disturbances, these instruments could reduce the lunar surface to within less than 1,500 yards. Chapter 11. Fancy and Reality. "Have you ever seen the moon?" asked a professor, ironically, of one of his pupils. "No, sir," replied the pupil, still more ironically, "but I must say I have heard it spoken of." In one sense, the pupil's witty answer might be given by a large majority of sublunary beings. How many people have heard speak of the moon who have never seen it, at least through a glass or a telescope? How many have never examined the map of their satellite? In looking at a selenographic map, one peculiarity strikes us. Contrary to the arrangement followed for that of the Earth and Mars, the continents occupy more particularly the southern hemisphere of the lunar globe. These continents do not show such decided, clear, and regular boundary lines as South America, Africa, and the Indian Peninsula. Their angular, capricious, and deeply indented coasts are rich in gulfs and peninsulas. They remind one of the confusion in the islands of the Sound, where the land is excessively indented. If navigation ever existed on the surface of the moon, it must have been wonderfully difficult and dangerous, and we may well pity the Selenite sailors and hydrographers, the former when they came upon these perilous coasts, the latter when they took the soundings of its stormy banks. You may also notice that, on the lunar sphere, the South Pole is much more continental than the North Pole. On the latter, there is but one slight strip of land separated from other continents by vast seas. Toward the south, continents clothe almost the whole of the hemisphere. It is even possible that the Selenites have already planted the flag on one of their poles, while Franklin, Ross, Kane, Dumont, D'Urville, and Lambert have never yet been able to attain that unknown point of the terrestrial globe. As to islands, they are numerous on the surface of the moon. Nearly all oblong or circular, and as if traced with the compass, they seem to form one vast archipelago, equal to that charming group lying between Greece and Asia Minor, and which mythology in ancient times adorned with most graceful legends. Involuntarily, the names of Naxos, Tenedos, and Carpathos rise before the mind, and we seek vainly for Ulysses' vessel or the clipper of the Argonauts. So at least it was in Mitchell Arden's eyes. To him, it was a Grecian archipelago that he saw on the map. To the eyes of his matter-of-fact companions, the aspect of these coasts recalled rather the parceled-out land of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. and where the Frenchmen discovered traces of the heroes of fable, these Americans were marking the most favorable points for the establishment of stores in the interests of lunar commerce and industry. After wandering over these vast continents, the eye is attracted by the still greater seas. Not only their formation, but their situation and aspect remind one of the terrestrial oceans. But again, as on Earth, these seas occupy the greater portion of the globe. But in point of fact, these are not liquid spaces, but plains, the nature of which the travelers hoped soon to determine. Astronomers, we must allow, have graced these pretended seas with at least odd names, which science has respected up to the present time. Mitchell Arden was right when he compared this map to a tender card, got up by a Scudery or Cyrano de Bergerac. Only, said he, it is no longer the sentimental card of the 17th century, it is the card of life, very neatly divided into two parts, one feminine, the other masculine, the right hemisphere for woman, the left for man. In speaking thus, Mitchell made his prosaic companions shrug their shoulders. Barbicane and Nicholl looked upon the lunar map from a very different point of view to that of their fantastic friend. Nevertheless, their fantastic friend was a little in the right. Judge for yourselves. In the left hemisphere stretches the Sea of Clouds, where human reason is so often shipwrecked. Not far off lies the Sea of Rains, fed by all the fever of existence. Near this is the Sea of Storms, where man is ever fighting against his passions, which too often gain the victory. Then, worn out by deceit, treasons, infidelity, and the whole body of terrestrial misery, what does he find at the end of his career? That vast sea of humors, barely softened by some drops of the waters from the Gulf of Dew. Clouds, rain, storms, and humors. Does the life of man contain aught but these? And is it not summed up in these four words? The right hemisphere, dedicated to the ladies, encloses smaller seas, whose significant names contain every incident of a feminine existence. There is the Sea of Serenity, over which the young girl bends, the Lake of Dreams, reflecting a joyous future, the Sea of Nectar, with its waves of tenderness and breezes of love, the Sea of Fruitfulness, the Sea of Crises, then the Sea of Vapors, whose dimensions are perhaps a little too confined, and lastly, that vast Sea of Tranquility, in which every false passion, every useless dream, every unsatisfied desire is at length absorbed, and whose waves emerge peacefully into the lake of death. What a strange succession of names, what a singular division of the moon's two hemispheres, joined to one another like man and woman, and forming that sphere of life carried into space. And was not the fantastic Mitchell right in thus interpreting the fancies of the ancient astronomers? But while his imagination thus roved over the seas, his grave companions were considering things more geographically. They were learning this new world by heart. They were measuring angles and diameters. Chapter 12. Orographic Details. The course taken by the projectile, as we have before remarked, was bearing it toward the moon's northern hemisphere. The travelers were far from the central point which they would have struck, had their course not been subject to an irremediable deviation. It was past midnight, and Barbicane then estimated the distance at 750 miles, which was a little greater than the length of the lunar radius, and which would diminish as it advanced nearer to the North Pole. The projectile was then not at the altitude of the equator, but across the 10th parallel, and from that latitude, carefully taken on the map to the pole, Barbicane and his two companions were able to observe the moon under the most favorable conditions. Indeed, by means of glasses, the above-named distance was reduced to little more than 14 miles. The telescope of the Rocky Mountains brought the moon much nearer, but the terrestrial atmosphere singularly lessened its power. Thus Barbicane, posted in his projectile, with the glasses to his eyes, could seize upon details which were almost imperceptible to earthly observers. "My friends," said the president in a serious voice, "I do not know whither we are going. I do not know if we shall ever see the terrestrial globe again. Nevertheless, let us proceed as if our work would one day be useful to our fellow men. Let us keep our minds free from every other consideration. We are astronomers, and this projectile is a room in the Cambridge University, carried into space. Let us make our observations." This said, work was begun with great exactness, and they faithfully reproduced the different aspects of the moon at the different distances which the projectile reached. At the time that the projectile was as high as the 10th parallel, north latitude, it seemed rigidly to follow the 20th degree, east longitude. We must here make one important remark with regard to the map by which they were taking observations. In the selenographical maps where, on account of the reversing of the objects by the glasses, the south is above and the north below, it would seem natural that, on account of that inversion, the east should be to the left hand and the west to the right. But it is not so. If the map were turned upside down, showing the moon as we see her, the east would be to the left and the west to the right, contrary to that which exists on terrestrial maps. The following is the reason of this anomaly. Observers in the northern hemisphere, say in Europe, see the moon in the south, according to them. When they take observations, they turn their backs to the north, the reverse position to that which they occupy when they study a terrestrial map. As they turn their backs to the north, the east is on their left, and the west to their right. To observers in the southern hemisphere, Patagonia for example, the moon's west would be quite to their left, and the east to their right, as the south is behind them. Such is the reason of the apparent reversing of these two cardinal points, and we must bear it in mind in order to be able to follow President Barbicane's observations. With the help of Boer and Moedler's Mappa Selenographica, the travelers were able at once to recognize that portion of the disk enclosed within the field of their glasses. "What are we looking at this moment?" asked Mitchell. "At the northern part of the Sea of Clouds," answered Barbicane. "We are too far off to recognize its nature. Are these plains composed of arid sand, as the first astronomer maintained, or are they nothing but immense forests, according to M. Warren de la Rue's opinion, who gives the moon an atmosphere, though a very low and a very dense one? That we shall know by and by. We must affirm nothing until we are in a position to do so. This Sea of Clouds is rather doubtfully marked out upon the maps. It is supposed that these vast plains are strewn with blocks of lava from the neighboring volcanoes on its right, Ptolemy, Purbach, Arzachel, but the projectile was advancing and sensibly nearing it. Soon there appeared the heights which bound this sea at this northern limit. Before them rose a mountain radiant with beauty, the top of which seemed lost in an eruption of solar rays. "That is?" asked Mitchell. "Copernicus," replied Barbicane. "Let us see Copernicus." This mount, situated in 9 degrees north latitude and degrees east longitude, rose to a height of 10,600 feet above the surface of the moon. It is quite visible from the Earth, and astronomers can study it with ease, particularly during the phase between the last quarter and the new moon, because then the shadows are thrown lengthways from east to west, allowing them to measure the heights. This Copernicus forms the most important of the radiating system, situated in the southern hemisphere, according to Tycho Brahe. It rises isolated like a gigantic lighthouse on that portion of the Sea of Clouds, which is bounded by the Sea of Tempests, thus lighting by its splendid rays 2 oceans at a time. It was a sight without an equal, those long luminous trains, so dazzling in the full moon, and which, passing the boundary chain on the north, extends to the Sea of Rains. At 1 o'clock of the terrestrial morning, the projectile, like a balloon borne into space, overlooked the top of this superb mount. Barbicane could recognize perfectly its chief features. Copernicus is comprised in the series of ringed mountains of the first order, in the division of great circles. Like Kepler and Aristarchus, which overlooked the ocean of tempests, sometimes it appeared like a brilliant point through the cloudy light, and was taken for a volcano in activity. But it is only an extinct one, like all on that side of the moon. Its circumference showed a diameter of about 22 leagues. The glasses discovered traces of stratification produced by successive eruptions, and the neighborhood was strewn with volcanic remains which still choked some of the craters. "There exist," said Barbicane, "several kinds of circles on the surface of the moon, and it is easy to see that Copernicus belongs to the radiating class. If we were nearer, we should see the cones bristling on the inside, which in former times were so many fiery mouths. A curious arrangement, and one without an exception on the lunar disk, is that the interior surface of these circles is the reverse of the exterior, and contrary to the form taken by terrestrial craters. It follows, then, that the general curve of the bottom of these circles gives a sphere of a smaller diameter than that of the moon." "And why this peculiar disposition?" asked Nishal. We do not know, replied Barbicane. What splendid radiation, said Mitchell. One could hardly see a finer spectacle, I think. What would you say, then, replied Barbicane, if chance should bear us toward the southern hemisphere? Well, I should say that it was still more beautiful, retorted Mitchell Arden. At this moment, the projectile hung perpendicularly over the circle. The circumference of Copernicus formed almost a perfect circle, and its steep escarpments were clearly defined. They could even distinguish a second ringed enclosure. Around spread a grayish plain of a wild aspect, on which every relief was marked in yellow. At the bottom of the circle, as if enclosed in a jewel case, sparkled for one instant 2 or 3 eruptive cones, like enormous dazzling gems. Toward the north, the escarpments were lowered by a depression which would probably have given access to the interior of the crater. In passing over the surrounding plains, Barbicane noticed a great number of less important mountains, and among others, a little ringed one called Guy Lussac, the breadth of which measured 12 miles. Toward the south, the plain was very flat, without one elevation, without one projection. Toward the north, on the contrary, till where it was bounded by the Sea of Storms, it resembled a liquid surface agitated by a storm, of which the hills and hollows formed a succession of waves suddenly congealed. Over the whole of this, and in all directions, lay the luminous lines, all converging to the summit of Copernicus. The travelers discussed the origin of these strange rays, but they could not determine their nature any more than terrestrial observers. But why, said Nishal, should not these rays be simply spurs of mountains, which reflect more vividly the light of the sun? No, replied Barbicane. If it was so, under certain conditions of the moon, these ridges would cast shadows, and they do not cast any. And indeed, these rays only appeared when the orb of day was in opposition to the moon, and disappeared as soon as its rays became oblique. But how have they endeavored to explain these lines of light? Asked Mitchell, for I cannot believe that savants would ever be stranded for want of an explanation. Yes, replied Barbicane, Herschel has put forward an opinion, but he did not venture to affirm it. Never mind, what was the opinion? He thought that these rays might be streams of cooled lava which shone when the sun beat straight upon them. It may be so, but nothing can be less certain. Besides, if we pass nearer to Tycho, we shall be in a better position to find out the cause of this radiation. Do you know, my friends, what that plain, seen from the height we are at, resembles? Said Mitchell. No, replied Nishal. Very well, with all those pieces of lava lengthened like rockets, it resembles an immense game of spelicans thrown pell-mell. There wants but the hook to pull them out one by one. Do be serious, said Barbicane. Well, let us be serious, replied Mitchell quietly, and instead of spelicans, let us put bones. This plain would then be nothing but an immense cemetery on which would repose the mortal remains of thousands of extinct generations. Do you prefer that high-flown comparison? One is as good as the other, retorted Barbicane. My word, you are difficult to please, answered Mitchell. My worthy friend, continued the matter-of-fact Barbicane, it matters but little what it resembles when we do not know what it is. Well answered, exclaimed Mitchell. That will teach me to reason with savants. But the projectile continued to advance with almost uniform speed around the lunar disk. The travelers, we may easily imagine, did not dream of taking a moment's rest. Every minute changed the landscape which fled from beneath their gaze. About 1:30 in the morning, they caught a glimpse of the tops of another mountain. Barbicane, consulting his map, recognized Eratosthenes. It was a ringed mountain 9,000 feet high, and one of those circles so numerous on this satellite. With regard to this, Barbicane related Kepler's singular opinion on the formation of circles. According to that celebrated mathematician, these crater-like cavities had been dug by the hand of man. For what purpose? Asked Nishal. For a very natural one, replied Barbicane. The Selenites might have undertaken these immense works and dug these enormous holes for a refuge and shield from the solar rays which beat upon them during 15 consecutive days. "The Selenites are not fools," said Mitchell. "A singular idea," replied Nicholl, "but it is probable that Kepler did not know the true dimensions of these circles, for the digging of them would have been the work of giants, quite impossible for the Selenites." "Why, if weight on the moon's surface is 6 times less than on the Earth," said Mitchell. "But if the Selenites are 6 times smaller," retorted Nicholl. "And if there are no Selenites," added Barbicane. This put an end to the discussion. Soon Eratosthenes disappeared under the horizon without the projectile being sufficiently near to allow close observation. This mountain separated the Apennines from the Carpathians. In the lunar orography, they have discerned some chains of mountains, which are chiefly distributed over the northern hemisphere. Some, however, occupy certain portions of the southern hemisphere also. About 2 o'clock in the morning, Barbicane found that they were above the 20th lunar parallel. The distance of the projectile from the moon was not more than 600 miles. Barbicane, now perceiving that the projectile was steadily approaching the lunar disk, did not despair, if not of reaching her, at least of discovering the secrets of her configuration. Chapter 13. Lunar Landscapes. At 2:30 in the morning, the projectile was over the 13th lunar parallel and at the effective distance of 500 miles, reduced by the glasses to 5. It still seemed impossible, however, that it could ever touch any part of the disk. Its motive speed, comparatively so moderate, was inexplicable to President Barbicane. At that distance from the moon, it must have been considerable to enable it to bear up against her attraction. Here was a phenomenon the cause of which escaped them again. Besides, time failed them to investigate the cause. All lunar relief was defiling under the eyes of the travelers, and they would not lose a single detail. Under the glasses, the disk appeared at the distance of 5 miles. What would an aeronaut, borne to this distance from the Earth, distinguish on its surface? We cannot say, since the greatest ascension has not been more than 25,000 feet. This, however, is an exact description of what Barbicane and his companions saw at this height. Large patches of different colors appeared on the disk. Selenographers are not agreed upon the nature of these colors. There are several, and rather vividly marked. Julius Schmidt pretends that, if the terrestrial oceans were dried up, a selenite observer could not distinguish on the globe a greater diversity of shades between the oceans and the continental plains than those on the moon present to a terrestrial observer. According to him, the color common to the vast plains known by the name of seas is a dark gray mixed with green and brown. Some of the large craters present the same appearance. Barbicane knew this opinion of the German selenographer, an opinion shared by Boer and Moedler. Observation has proved that right was on their side, and not on that of some astronomers who admit the existence of only gray on the moon's surface. In some parts, green was very distinct, such as springs, according to Julius Schmidt, from the seas of Serenity and Humors. Barbicane also noticed large craters, without any interior cones, which shed a bluish tint similar to the reflection of a sheet of steel freshly polished. These colors belonged really to the lunar disk, and did not result, as some astronomers say, either from the imperfection in the objective of the glasses or from the interposition of the terrestrial atmosphere. Not a doubt existed in Barbicane's mind with regard to it, as he observed it through space, and so could not commit any optical error. He considered the establishment of this fact as an acquisition to science. Now, were these shades of green, belonging to tropical vegetation, kept up by a low, dense atmosphere? He could not yet say. Farther on, he noticed a reddish tint, quite defined. The same shade had before been observed at the bottom of an isolated enclosure, known by the name of Lichtenberg Circle, which is situated near the Hercynian Mountains on the borders of the moon, but they could not tell the nature of it. They were not more fortunate with regard to another peculiarity of the disk, for they could not decide upon the cause of it. Michel Ardan was watching near the president when he noticed long white lines vividly lighted up by the direct rays of the sun. It was a succession of luminous furrows, very different from the radiation of Copernicus not long before, they ran parallel with each other. Mitchell, with his usual readiness, hastened to exclaim, "Look there, cultivated fields." "Cultivated fields," replied Nishal, shrugging his shoulders. "Ploughed at all events," retorted Mitchell Arden, "but what laborers those Selenites must be, and what giant oxen they must harness to their plough to cut such furrows." "They are not furrows," said Barbicane, "they are rifts." "Rifts, stuff," replied Mitchell mildly, "but what do you mean by rifts in the scientific world?" Barbicane immediately enlightened his companion as to what he knew about lunar rifts. He knew that they were a kind of furrow found on every part of the disk which was not mountainous, that these furrows, generally isolated, measured fro to 500 leagues in length, that their breadth varied fro 0 to 1,500 yards, and that their borders were strictly parallel, but he knew nothing more either of their formation or their nature. Barbicane, through his glasses, observed these rifts with great attention. He noticed that their borders were formed of steep declivities. They were long parallel ramparts, and with some small amount of imagination, he might have admitted the existence of long lines of fortifications raised by Selenite engineers. Of these different rifts, some were perfectly straight, as if cut by a line, others were slightly curved, though still keeping their borders parallel. Some crossed each other, some cut through craters. Here they wound through ordinary cavities, such as Posidonius or Petavius. There they wound through the seas, such as the Sea of Serenity. These natural accidents naturally excited the imaginations of these terrestrial astronomers. The first observations had not discovered these rifts. Neither Hevelius, Cassin, Lahaia, nor Herschel seemed to have known them. It was Schroeder who in 1789 first drew attention to them. Others followed who studied them, as Pastorff, Gruithuisen, Boer, and Moedler. At this time their number amounts to 70, but if they have been counted, their nature has not yet been determined. They are certainly not fortifications, any more than they are the ancient beds of dried-up rivers. For on one side, the waters, so slight on the moon's surface, could never have worn such drains for themselves, and on the other, they often cross craters of great elevation. We must, however, allow that Mitchell Arden had an idea, and that, without knowing it, he coincided in that respect with Julius Schmidt. "Why," said he, "should not these unaccountable appearances be simply phenomena of vegetation?" "What do you mean?" asked Barbicane quickly. "Do not excite yourself, my worthy president," replied Mitchell. "Might it not be possible that the dark lines forming that bastion were rows of trees regularly placed?" "You stick to your vegetation, then," said Barbicane. "I like," retorted Mitchell Arden, "to explain what you savants cannot explain. At least my hypothesis has the advantage of indicating why these rifts disappear, or seem to disappear, at certain seasons." "And for what reason?" "For the reason that the trees become invisible when they lose their leaves, and visible again when they regain them." "Your explanation is ingenious, my dear companion," replied Barbicane, "but inadmissible." "Why?" "Because, so to speak, there are no seasons on the moon's surface, and that, consequently, the phenomena of vegetation of which you speak cannot occur. Indeed, the slight obliquity of the lunar axis keeps the sun at an almost equal height in every latitude. Above the equatorial regions, the radiant orb almost invariably occupies the zenith, and does not pass the limits of the horizon in the polar regions. Thus, according to each region, there reigns a perpetual winter, spring, summer, or autumn, as in the planet Jupiter, whose axis is but little inclined upon its orbit. What origin do they attribute to these rifts? That is a question difficult to solve. They are certainly anterior to the formation of craters and circles, for several have introduced themselves by breaking through their circular ramparts. Thus it may be that, contemporary with the later geological epochs, they are due to the expansion of natural forces. But the projectile had now attained the 40th degree of lunar latitude, at a distance not exceeding 40 miles. Through the glasses objects appeared to be only 4 miles distant. At this point, under their feet, rose Mount Helicon, 15–20 feet high, and round about the left rose moderate elevations, enclosing a small portion of the Sea of Rains, under the name of the Gulf of Iris. The terrestrial atmosphere would have to be 170 times more transparent than it is, to allow astronomers to make perfect observations on the moon's surface. But in the void in which the projectile floated, no fluid interposed itself between the eye of the observer and the object observed. And more, Barbicane found himself carried to a greater distance than the most powerful telescopes had ever done before, either that of Lord Rosse or that of the Rocky Mountains. He was, therefore, under extremely favorable conditions for solving that great question of the habitability of the moon, but the solution still escaped him. He could distinguish nothing but desert beds, immense plains, and toward the north, arid mountains. Not a work betrayed the hand of man, not a ruin marked his course, not a group of animals was to be seen indicating life, even in an inferior degree. In no part was there life, in no part was there an appearance of vegetation. Of the three kingdoms which share the terrestrial globe between them, one alone was represented on the lunar, and that the mineral. "Ah, indeed," said Mitchell Arden, a little out of countenance, "then you see no one." "No," answered Nicholl. "Up to this time, not a man, not an animal, not a tree. After all, whether the atmosphere has taken refuge at the bottom of cavities, in the midst of the circles, or even on the opposite face of the moon, we cannot decide." "Besides," added Barbicane, "even to the most piercing eye a man cannot be distinguished farther than 3.5 miles off, so that, if there are any Selenites, they can see our projectile, but we cannot see them." Toward 4 in the morning, at the height of the 50th parallel, the distance was reduced to 300 miles. To the left ran a line of mountains capriciously shaped, lying in the full light. To the right, on the contrary, lay a black hollow resembling a vast well, unfathomable and gloomy, drilled into the lunar soil. This hole was the Black Lake. It was Pluto, a deep circle which can be conveniently studied from the Earth, between the last quarter and the new moon, when the shadows fall from west to east. This black color is rarely met with on the surface of the satellite. As yet it has only been recognized in the depths of the circle of Endymion, to the east of the Cold Sea, in the northern hemisphere, and at the bottom of Grimaldi's circle, on the equator, toward the eastern border of the orb. Pluto is an annular mountain, situated in 51 degrees north latitude and degrees east longitude. Its circuit is 47 miles long and 32 broad. Barbicane regretted that they were not passing directly above this vast opening. There was an abyss to fathom, perhaps some mysterious phenomenon to surprise, but the projectile's course could not be altered. They must rigidly submit. They could not guide a balloon, still less a projectile, when once enclosed within its walls. Toward 5 in the morning, the northern limits of the Sea of Rains was at length passed. The mounts of Condamine and Fontenelle remained, one on the right, the other on the left. That part of the disk, beginning with 60 degrees, was becoming quite mountainous. The glasses brought them to within 2 miles, less than that separating the summit of Mont Blanc from the level of the sea. The whole region was bristling with spikes and circles. Toward the 60 degrees Philolaus stood predominant at a height of 50 feet with its elliptical crater, and seen from this distance, the disk showed a very fantastical appearance. Landscapes were presented to the eye under very different conditions from those on the Earth, and also very inferior to them. The moon having no atmosphere, the consequences arising from the absence of this gaseous envelope have already been shown. No twilight on her surface, night following day and day following night, with the suddenness of a lamp which is extinguished or lighted amid profound darkness. No transition from cold to heat, the temperature falling in an instant from boiling point to the cold of space. Another consequence of this want of air is that absolute darkness reigns where the sun's rays do not penetrate. That which on Earth is called diffusion of light, that luminous matter which the air holds in suspension, which creates the twilight and the daybreak, which produces the umbra and penumbra, and all the magic of chiaroscuro, does not exist on the moon. Hence the harshness of contrasts, which only admit of 2 colors, black and white. If a Selenite were to shade his eyes from the sun's rays, the sky would seem absolutely black, and the stars would shine to him as on the darkest night. Judge of the impression produced on Barbicane and his three friends by this strange scene. Their eyes were confused. They could no longer grasp the respective distances of the different planes. A lunar landscape without the softening of the phenomena of chiaroscuro could not be rendered by an earthly landscape painter. It would be spots of ink on a white page, nothing more. This aspect was not altered even when the projectile, at the height of 80 degrees, was only separated from the moon by a distance of 50 miles, nor even when, at 5 in the morning, it passed at less than 25 miles from the mountain of Gioja, a distance reduced by the glasses to a quarter of a mile. It seemed as if the moon might be touched by the hand. It seemed impossible that, before long, the projectile would not strike her, if only at the North Pole, the brilliant arch of which was so distinctly visible on the black sky. Mitchell Arden wanted to open one of the scuttles and throw himself on to the moon's surface. A very useless attempt, for if the projectile could not attain any point whatever of the satellite, Mitchell, carried along by its motion, could not attain it either. At that moment, at 6 o'clock, the lunar pole appeared. The disk only presented to the travelers gaze one half brilliantly lit up, while the other disappeared in the darkness. Suddenly, the projectile passed the line of demarcation between intense light and absolute darkness, and was plunged in profound night. Chapter 14. The night of 354 hours and a half. At the moment when this phenomenon took place so rapidly, the projectile was skirting the moon's north pole at less than 25 miles distance. Some seconds had sufficed to plunge it into the absolute darkness of space. The transition was so sudden, without shade, without gradation of light, without attenuation of the luminous waves, that the orb seemed to have been extinguished by a powerful blow. Melted, disappeared, Mitchell Arden exclaimed, aghast. Indeed, there was neither reflection nor shadow. Nothing more was to be seen of that disk, formerly so dazzling. The darkness was complete, and rendered even more so by the rays from the stars. It was that blackness, in which the lunar nights are ensteeped, which last 354 hours and a half at each point of the disk, a long night resulting from the equality of the translatory and rotary movements of the moon. The projectile, emerged in the conical shadow of the satellite, experienced the action of the solar rays no more than any of its invisible points. In the interior, the obscurity was complete. They could not see each other, hence the necessity of dispelling the darkness. However desirous Barbicane might be to husband the gas, the reserve of which was small, he was obliged to ask from it a fictitious light, an expensive brilliancy which the sun then refused. "Devil take the radiant orb," exclaimed Mitchell Arden, "which forces us to expend gas instead of giving us his rays gratuitously." "Do not let us accuse the sun," said Nicholl. "It is not his fault, but that of the moon, which has come and placed herself like a screen between us and it." "It is the sun," continued Mitchell. "It is the moon," retorted Nicholl. An idle dispute, which Barbicane put an end to by saying, "My friends, it is neither the fault of the sun nor of the moon. It is the fault of the projectile, which, instead of rigidly following its course, has awkwardly missed it. To be more just, it is the fault of that unfortunate meteor which has so deplorably altered our first direction." "Well," replied Mitchell Arden, "as the matter is settled, let us have breakfast. After a whole night of watching, it is fair to build ourselves up a little." This proposal meeting with no contradiction, Mitchell prepared the repast in a few minutes. But they ate for eating's sake, they drank without toasts, without hurrahs. The bold travelers, being borne away into gloomy space, without their accustomed cortege of rays, felt a vague uneasiness in their hearts. The strange shadow so dear to Victor Hugo's pen bound them on all sides, but they talked over the interminable night of 354 hours and a half, nearly 15 days, which the law of physics has imposed on the inhabitants of the moon. Barbicane gave his friends some explanation of the causes and the consequences of this curious phenomenon. "Curious indeed," said they, "for if each hemisphere of the moon is deprived of solar light for 15 days, that above which we now float, does not even enjoy, during its long night, any view of the earth so beautifully lit up. In a word, she has no moon, applying this designation to our globe, but on one side of her disk. Now, if this were the case with the earth, if, for example, Europe never saw the moon, and she was only visible at the antipodes, imagine to yourself the astonishment of a European on arriving in Australia. They would make the voyage for nothing but to see the moon, replied Mitchell. Very well, continued Barbicane, that astonishment is reserved for the Selenites who inhabit the face of the moon opposite to the earth, a face which is ever invisible to our countrymen of the terrestrial globe. And which we should have seen, added Nishal, if we had arrived here when the moon was new, that is to say 15 days later. I will add, to make amends, continued Barbicane, that the inhabitants of the visible face are singularly favored by nature, to the detriment of their brethren on the invisible face. The latter, as you see, have dark nights of 354 hours, without one single ray to break the darkness. The other, on the contrary, when the sun which has given its light for 15 days sinks below the horizon, see a splendid orb rise on the opposite horizon. It is the earth, which is 13 times greater than the diminutive moon that we know, the earth which develops itself at a diameter of 2 degrees, and which sheds a light 13 times greater than that qualified by atmospheric strata, the earth which only disappears at the moment when the sun reappears in its turn. Nicely worded, said Mitchell, slightly academical perhaps. It follows then, continued Barbicane without knitting his brows, that the visible face of the disk must be very agreeable to inhabit, since it always looks on either the sun when the moon is full, or on the earth when the moon is new. But, said Nishal, that advantage must be well compensated by the insupportable heat which the light brings with it. The inconvenience, in that respect, is the same for the two faces, for the earth's light is evidently deprived of heat, but the invisible face is still more searched by the heat than the visible face. I say that for you, Nishal, because Mitchell will probably not understand. Thank you, said Mitchell. Indeed, continued Barbicane, when the invisible face receives at the same time light and heat from the sun, it is because the moon is new, that is to say, she is situated between the sun and the earth. It follows then, considering the position which she occupies in opposition when full, that she is nearer to the sun by twice her distance from the earth, and that distance may be estimated at the 200th part of that which separates the sun from the earth, or in round numbers 400,000 miles, so that invisible face is so much nearer to the sun when she receives its rays. Quite right, replied Nishal. On the contrary, continued Barbicane. One moment, said Mitchell, interrupting his grave companion. What do you want? I asked to be allowed to continue the explanation. And why? To prove that I understand. Get along with you, said Barbicane, smiling. On the contrary, said Mitchell, imitating the tone and gestures of the president, on the contrary, when the visible face of the moon is lit by the sun, it is because the moon is full, that is to say, opposite the sun with regard to the earth. The distance separating it from the radiant orb is then increased in round numbers to 400,000 miles, and the heat which she receives must be a little less. Very well said, exclaimed Barbicane. Do you know, Mitchell, that, for an amateur, you are intelligent? Yes, replied Mitchell coolly, we are also on the Boulevard des Italiens. Barbicane gravely grasped the hand of his amiable companion, and continued to enumerate the advantages reserved for the inhabitants of the visible face. Among others, he mentioned eclipses of the sun, which only take place on this side of the lunar disk, since, in order that they may take place, it is necessary for the moon to be in opposition. These eclipses, caused by the interposition of the earth between the moon and the sun, can last 2 hours, during which time, by reason of the rays refracted by its atmosphere, the terrestrial globe can appear as nothing but a black point upon the sun. So, said Nishal, there is a hemisphere, that invisible hemisphere which is very ill supplied, very ill treated by nature. Never mind, replied Mitchell, If we ever become Selenites, we will inhabit the visible face. I like the light. Unless, by any chance, answered Nishal, the atmosphere should be condensed on the other side, as certain astronomers pretend. That would be a consideration, said Mitchell. Breakfast over, the observers returned to their post. They tried to see through the darkened scuttles by extinguishing all light in the projectile, but not a luminous spark made its way through the darkness.